to have an opening address. Dr. Jigna is our program chair for Masters in Conservation and Regeneration at CEPT University, and she is also executive director for Center for Heritage Conservation at CRDF. Screen is yours, Dr. Jigna.
Thank you very much, Mridula. I think I have 10 minutes and I'm going to take a little bit of time to also give a bit of background to what we have been doing. Let me start by welcoming everyone, our eminent speakers and panelists, students of Masters in Conservation and Regeneration, other participants, tutors, and our entire team who've set this up. I think most of us are here, and some of the participants may be watching this from the YouTube live. We are also getting kind of hold of these new technologies and new ways of reaching out. So welcome everyone. We are very happy to start our third open webinar in this academic year. Through our program at Faculty of Architecture, we have been since last couple of years hosting open seminars in order to bring the discourses of conservation to all who are interested. And like everyone, we moved to the online mode with the pandemic and introduced the webinars. The first one being, I think it was in August 2020, on documenting cultural heritage. Then the second one being risk assessment of cultural sites. And this is our third one. What we've learned from this situation is that while seminars bring people's personal connects and webinars bring a better accessibility to participants who are not here in Ahmedabad, are able to access this deep pool of knowledge, but also we are able to connect with experts around the world, around across geographic region, like we have Professor Mckay here today. And despite of his odd timing just now in Australia, he's agreed to be a part of this discussion. Going forward, we hope to find ways of bringing together the best of both. Coming to the theme of this webinar, which is understanding archaeology. Archaeology and conservation have a long and common history together, especially in India, as any conversation about history, legislation, regulation, and guidelines of conservation in India, we begin with approaches and processes of Archaeological Survey of India. Today, we are extremely privileged and delighted to have voices from ASI, from state archaeology departments, and from academia interacting with one another. Heartily, I thank Janvish Sharma, Dr. Pages Gargay, Professor Shanti Papu, and Dr. Varat Sabnis for joining us as panelists. I'm sure Mridula will give detailed introduction to all of them when we start the panel discussion. Before I go on to introduce our keynote speaker, let me thank Mridula Mane. She is a conservation architect and an intrinsic part of the Center for Heritage Conservation and the MCR program. She was the one who thought up this seminar and this webinar and put it together. So thank you very much, Mridula, for doing this. And her entire team, and special thanks to, I think, Juhi and Firak, and I'm sorry if I'm missing out anybody's names here. Our keynote speaker today is Professor Richard Mckay, whom I had first met at a conference in Jeonju in 2015 and then in May 2019 at Sydney. Hearing his ideas and sensitive approach to conservation of archaeological sites and sort of brought or consolidated my beliefs in an understanding in people-centered conservation. This was only reiterated when he was kind enough to show me around the archaeological remains of the rock at Sydney and introducing a very progressive attitude to conserving them. Professor Richard Mckay, AM, is a prominent Australian archaeologist and the director of possibilities at Mackay Strategic. He's also a cultural heritage advisor to the UNESCO World Heritage Committee, an adjunct professor at Deakin University, and a former chair of the Australian World Heritage Advisory Committee. Richard has worked on major colonial archaeology, cultural tourism, and heritage projects throughout Australia and Asia. In 2003, he was made the member in the General Division of the Order of Australia for services to archaeology and cultural heritage. We're extremely privileged to have you with us today, Richard, and thank you for being with us despite the time differences. I think I hand over the screen and the mic to you.
Well, Jigna, thank you very much for that introduction, and good afternoon, colleagues. And I thank the Centre and the organisers for the opportunity to speak with you today. I shall now share my screen, and technology permitting, will commence the presentation. Medulla, if you wouldn't mind, could you just nod to confirm that this is now successfully shared?
Yes, we can see the title slide.
Well, thank you. And the title of my presentation today is Conservation Management, Adaptation and Presentation of Archaeological Sites, Sydney on the Rocks. And it is a case study of a colonial archaeological site in Sydney from the 18th and 19th century, so very early in an Australian colonial context. And it demonstrates an alternative approach to conserving, managing, adapting and presenting a significant archaeological site. So I shall commence by showing you where this property is. I'm presuming that most of you will be familiar with Australia, and the site is in the state of New South Wales. It's in the city of Sydney, and specifically it's in a precinct on Sydney Harbour, right at the centre of Sydney, the centre of first settlement, and this precinct is known as the Rocks. And the site about which I'm going to speak is shown on screen, and it is shown here in its excavated state, but I'm commencing with this image to provide some context for the proximity of this precinct to the main central business district of Sydney. This site exists immediately adjacent to major commercial city buildings, skyscrapers, and is on a very narrow peninsula that juts out into the Sydney Harbour. So the site exists on this peninsula in a small historic precinct jammed between the major part of central Sydney and the waters of Sydney Harbour. And when we commenced on site some years ago, this archaeological investigation, it was originally undertaken as a salvage project intended to uncover and record whatever remains were present of the early colonial settlement in Sydney on this site prior to another one of these large commercial towers being constructed. And for reasons that I will explain, that did not occur. So the condition of the site when the archaeologists first arrived was like this. It was it had been infilled over a number of years. It was vacant of any structures, and the archaeological remains were buried beneath literally meters of introduced fill. But I digress, and I would like to jump back nearly 2.5 centuries to the years when Sydney was first established as a colony through invasion by the British, who brought convicts, who brought prisoners from the other side of the world to Sydney Harbour to establish a new settlement. This is a historic image which is looking south from the shores of Sydney Harbour along this peninsula. It's a very similar view to the one with which I commenced. So you can see on the left of the screen, there is the waters of Sydney Cove, where the first European settlement in Australia occurred. And on the right, there is a rocky slope. And you can see some little houses up here on the rocks. And these are the rocks that gave the precinct its name. When Sydney was first settled, the soldiers and the government officials established a well-ordered colonial town at the head of the cove. And those prisoners who were able to do so were allowed to build their own houses separate from the formal settlement. And they did that on this rocky promontory. Hence, the precinct is known to this day as the Rocks. And there is very good historical documentation of the activities of the convicts. They were basically brought halfway around the world for the purpose of establishing a new colony using forced migration. And the colony was founded on the availability of this free supply of convict labour. And this is an image taken in the rocks of convict stonemasons at work in the 1790s. And there are many images and historic references to the convicts and the conditions under which they worked. They worked in gangs, providing labour, as we see here in the back. They used their own efforts to undertake logging and timber getting and stonemasonry, and the conditions are portrayed as very harsh. You can see, I'm sorry about these jumping of screen, you can see on the right here there is a convict who is being tied to a tripod and flogged, presumably as punishment. And there is a whole folklore that developed around the Australian convicts. And right up until the latter years of the 20th century, the traditional view of the convicts were that they were a lower order of society, that they were a criminal class, and that they lived in this world which was dominated by their overseers and by the military officials, and they lived a very disorderly, depressed kind of life. And what is very interesting about the site that I'm about to show you is that the picture that emerges from the archaeological evidence on site is a very different picture from the picture that has traditionally been presented through traditional historic research and understanding. Here again, we have a contemporary historic image of military officers standing to attention while a convict is being flogged by being tied to a post and being lashed. And this is the kind of imagery which people of my generation were shown during their primary school years as the foundational story of the establishment of Australia as a European-based nation in the 18th and early 19th century. Now, the site today, the site then evolved. And in the 19th century, it became heavily developed. And we see it here along Cumberland Street with a row of two-storey tenement houses, a two-storey hotel, a two-storey bakery, a number of single-storey houses. So it became very heavily developed. And by the end of the 19th century, what had been an open site with little huts and houses shown in the early image was fully occupied by a series of commercial buildings and residential developments. There were 45 buildings, and it's believed there was somewhere between 300 and 400 people living in close quarters on this site by the 1890s. Then in the 1890s, when the bubonic plague arrived in Sydney, the residents were evicted. All of the buildings were compulsorily acquired by government, and they were all demolished. So the site became flattened, and it was subsequently used. This is an aerial view of the site from the 1920s. So the site that we're talking about is this triangular piece in the middle of the image, and it became an erecting workshops for the construction of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So the Sydney Harbour Bridge is to the left in this image. And then after the industrial use for the bridge construction, the site was again demolished. More fuel was added, and it became a car park for buses. So the image you see here is the same triangular historic site with the double-decker buses parked there during the day. And in the foreground of this site, you can see 8 lanes of traffic, which is the approach to the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which is to the left of the screen. And so this site, in close proximity to the city, adjacent to the Harbour Bridge, vacant for many years and used as a bus park, was identified as an opportunity for development by the state government. And prior to that development, it was proposed to undertake an archaeological dig to record and remove any significant archaeological features. And what happened is that the dig revealed far more than anybody had ever imagined. Not only were present the foundations of the 45 buildings from the second half of the 19th century, but there were literally hundreds of thousands of artifacts in sealed, intact stratified deposits associated with the 19th century development. And then beneath that, also intact, were remains of the convict huts from the 1780s and 1790s. In other words, remains from the very first phase of European settlement on the continent, sitting here intact, in situ, and remained buried beneath those additional layers that had been added for the workshops and the car park during the course of the history of the site. And what we found was that there was a great three-dimensionality. So there were wells, there were cesspits, there were fireplaces, foundations, an extensive archaeological resource, a large amount of artifactual data which could be identified and related to individual households for which there were historic records, and a picture of both convicts and mid-19th century Australian residents that from the archaeological evidence was extremely different from the picture that emerged through the historical record. So what did we find? Well, we found the structures themselves. And this image is a very good example of the nature of the deposits. What you are looking at here is a stone and brick square foundation, of a house that was built in the 1850s, one of the 45 residential buildings on the site. And you can see to the left of the screen, there is the remains of the fireplace in this room. But beneath that, cut into the living rock, and this is the same rock that you could see in that original historic image, cut into the living rock, is a well, and there are features that relate to an earlier building that stratigraphically would appear to date from the 1790s, from the very first phase of the European occupation. And this was very typical, so that throughout the site we had this duality of overlays of very early convict remains and then later remains of the community that lived there through the 19th century. There were wells, and the wells were wonderful because the demolitions that had occurred in relation to the bubonic plague and the subsequent construction workshops had sealed the site. So, for example, this well, and I will show you some of the contents from this well a little later in the presentation, this well related to a man who was a convict, but also a butcher, and it was used from about 1805 until about 1815, a beautiful stratigraphic sequence and an intact anaerobic sealed deposit, which provided a time capsule related to a decade of activity by a known convict individual. Now, the individual concerned was a convict called George Cripps, who had been sentenced to transportation by the British court, and he had come to Sydney. And contrary to what had been taught for generations in Australian schools, he was not in a chain gang or in a convict barracks. He was not whipped. He was not used for manual labour. He was a butcher, and he was allowed to move onto the rocks, to build a house, to open a butchery shop, and he eventually established a small commercial empire while he was still serving out his sentence by the British courts. And so in this image, we see the interior of the crib well, from which we recovered huge numbers of artifacts, including in the top right-hand corner, a still for making alcohol, which is not something that you would normally associate with a 19th century convict under sentence. In the bottom right-hand corner, we see some fine Chinese porcelain that was in the well. There was vast numbers, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of remains from the butchery activities. This man would bring live animals into the site, butcher them on the spot, sell the meat, obviously, but he would dispose of the remains, including things like horns and jaws that were not saleable on the site. So we were able to get a lot of evidence about his activities from these artifacts. And most intriguingly, in the well was an entire Spode dinner set, which had been thrown. So Spode is a very high quality English ceramic, obviously had been imported, but an entire dinner set being used by a convict under sentence and then mysteriously dumped in its entirety down the well. And that was archaeologically very interesting. What transpired with the benefit of some historical research was an understanding that he was not only a butcher, he was a bigamist. He had one wife back in the United Kingdom, in Britain, and he had another wife here in Sydney. And at one stage, the wife from the United Kingdom sends letters to say that she's coming to Sydney. And the next thing we discover in the historical record is that the wife who is in Sydney posts a notice in the Sydney newspapers saying that she has left her husband, won't be responsible for his debts or anything else to do with him. So this is a very public notice. And at the same time, the dinner set seems to have been thrown down the well, presumably, or one could conjecture that it was thrown down the well by the Sydney wife on the basis that the wife who was coming from Britain was not going to be using her dinner set. Thank you very much. So all of that relates to that first period, and it tells a tale that is very different from the historical record. And we find the same thing with the tenements. The 45 residential buildings that are constructed on the site during the 19th century in very close quarters. So these are small houses. They are perhaps 2 rooms downstairs and 2 rooms upstairs, each room about 3 metres by 3 metres. And we know from the historical record that some of these houses contain families with up to 10 people. We know that they disposed of their rubbish under the floor, and the matrix on these sites is sometimes more artifact than it is actually dirt. They also disposed of things like the family pet. There's a dog skeleton there in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. And we know that the living conditions were extremely cramped. So for example, on the right-hand side of the screen is a communal cesspit. So this is a cesspit that would have been able to be used by multiple people at the same time. And it was shared by a number of households at the common rear of their properties. So a very dense, densely populated precinct in the 19th century. And again, a huge amount of information coming out of the archaeological record, which demonstrates that although the contemporary newspapers and the historical records show this area as a depressed slum and lacking in morals, in fact, there was a high degree of very interesting consumer durables, fashion elements which had been imported, elements associated with hygiene, toothbrushes, dentures, toothpaste and tooth cream, even a pair of dental pliers. And for those of you who are more morbid, even some of the teeth complete with cavities were recovered from some of the houses. And in relation to the morals, something that was extraordinarily interesting, because there were social commentators, particularly religious social commentators, who were writing at the time about what a terrible den of depravity the Rocks area was. And yet inside the houses are things like this moral china that is for children, that gives them strong messages about being a good girl, or about children behaving appropriately, about frugality or industry. And the point of all of this is that the physical evidence on the site provides a window into this community, which is vastly different from what had been understood from the archaeological record. And fascinating amongst all of this was a single artifact, which is a a bone pessary, a contraceptive device, very controversial for its time, only available through a catalogue from the United States. So we have this supposedly depressed, depraved community, but they are ordering material from catalogues in the United Kingdom to introduce relatively modern techniques for contemporary living. And so before moving on to the treatment and management and presentation of the site itself, I just highlight that the evidence that came from the archaeology very strongly challenged the traditional historical narratives and what had been understood and taught for many years about these convict and later tenant communities in this precinct of the rocks. So there was a very strong story to tell, and it was a story that was very strongly associated with this site that had been earmarked for removal and development. And so the government made a decision, this is the state government, that the archaeological remains would not be removed. But by this stage, of course, the archaeological excavation had happened. And so what was left was an opportunity to peel back the layers. The site in its excavated form, on the left here, we have a historical image, and you can see this is one of the laneways through the site. This image dates from around the 1870s, and we know who these children are. These are the Foy children. And you can see here a building with a gable at the rear of the image. This building still stands. So the two images are taken from the same perspective. These children are sitting on this very stone, which is the doorstep to one of these houses. And the physical evidence on site enabled a peeling back of the layers of history. And what was ultimately decided was that some different new development would be permitted on the site, but new development which refilled and interpreted some of that history. So the way in which this site looks today is like this. And instead of the Foy children sitting on the doorstep, we actually have my children sitting on the doorstep. But more of this story to come. We also found that there was extraordinary media interest in this project. Located right in the heart of a major urban centre, with new stories about our history and our past being revealed as the dig unfolded. Media attendance was a regular event. What you're seeing on screen here is a small class of school children who are standing in one of these mid-19th century tenement houses being told about the archaeology and history while the media crew records it all for the evening television news. And then this led to a program with the collaboration of government where there were tours and tens of thousands of people came to visit the site while the excavation was on to experience the archaeology, to have a visceral engagement with the place, with the reality of its fabric, to meet the archaeologists, to understand what was being revealed about this history as the layers were peeled back. And we instigated a program which allowed the community to come and to participate. So they didn't just have to hear about the site on the media or come and visit the site on a tour. They could actually sign on and come and undertake archaeological excavation for a day. Some people came for a week, some people came for months. And I'd make the point with this that using community diggers in this capacity actually takes more resources than employing archaeologists, because they have to be very carefully managed and supervised. But the opportunity that is provided is connecting people directly with the site through participation in archaeology as an event. The site ultimately led to the development of a series of educational resources, and we did a lot of work to link the site with both secondary and primary school curriculum, and developed teaching resources which enabled people to use the site itself and the records and the artifacts as part of classroom learning. and there was an extraordinary array of publications, from learned papers in referred academic journals to a popular book to regular coverage in the media, magazine pieces, and the like. So there was a very strong outward presentation of the site to the community during the course of the project, as it became apparent how important this site was to an understanding of Sydney's colonial history. And then at the very end of the excavation, as the aforementioned book was published, there was a celebration, and we brought back on site, and you can see them here, the archaeological team and the people who had come and volunteered for more than a week. So I don't know how many people are in this image, but it's a large number of people who were actually physically involved on site in peeling back those layers of history and undertaking the archaeological excavation. Which brings me to the point that I made earlier, that part of the value of this site, therefore, is not simply the physical resource, the site itself, the artifacts, the remains. It's not simply the historical resources that allow us to analyse and understand and interact with the evidence provided by the physical archaeology. It's also the social and community context. The site has significance of itself because of its research value, but also because of its social value as a place where people experienced history and archaeology. And one of the unusual attributes of this site is it has now been, some years ago, included on the New South Wales State Heritage Register. So that's the second most senior level of heritage listing available in this country. Indeed, because of its history, because of its physical evidence, but also because of its social significance as a major place where archaeology was done. And I have spoken and written elsewhere about this issue, which I summarise in a simple diagram to say that most archaeological management is focused on the bottom left-hand corner, the physical evidence of the places and artefacts, and where there has been academic input and sites have been studied and analysed. Often what happens is the top part of this pyramid, or this triangle, which is that this is undertaken within a framework of existing knowledge and theory. But for some places, they are also important because of their social values and their community context. And so what we find is, if we're worried about the physical evidence, then our management is focused on physical conservation. If we are looking to communicate what comes out of the archaeological investigation, then that might be done by stories, by publications, or by media. But if we're actually looking to create a connection between the physical evidence of the place and its community context through its social value, then this is something that happens through engagement with the place itself. In other words, through events, through experiencing the site. Which brings me to the place. At the conclusion of the archaeological excavation, there was a vacant site with exposed archaeological remains and a decision by government that there would not be a commercial tower. And you can see here, this image also provides some other perspectives on where the site is located. For those not familiar with Sydney, the high-rise buildings that I showed in the first image are to the right of this screen. And you can just see in the middle of the screen to the left, the sails of the Sydney Opera House. So this site is right on Sydney Harbour and right between the main city and the wonderful harbourscape, with a commanding position up high on this rocky ledge overlooking Sydney Cove at the time of the first European settlement. And what was left at the end of the archaeological excavation looked like this. It was the physical remains, the tanks and the wells had been backfilled. The site was stable but exposed to weather. And what ultimately happened is an interesting story in integrated, innovative conservation development in the context of connecting this site with an avid, eager and interested community. Which brings me to the project. And through an open expression of interest project conducted by government, the Youth Hostel organisation, so Australia's national youth hostel organisation, won a competition to build a youth hostel. In other words, budget accommodation, predominantly for young people, on this site, together with an archaeology education centre. So as well as being lucky enough to be the excavation director for this project, I then became the conservation and interpretation director for the construction of what has become known as the Sydney Harbour YHA, or Sydney Harbour Youth Hostel. And you can see here the triangular form of the site with two separate accommodation buildings, and the black building at the bottom is an archaeology education centre. And the way in which this building was inserted is as a modern building, but reflective of the urban form in this historic context. And you can see the new building here along the first streetscape that I showed you in one of the earlier images, the two accommodation buildings. And in here is the entrance to the historic laneway, which was shown in one of the first images, with some screens that interpret the hotel and the bakery that flank that laneway. This is the Archaeology Education Centre, which sits above and overlooking the main area, which was the home and the butchery shop, and ultimately also a hotel, a public hotel, operated by the extraordinary convict, George Cribbs. You can see on the right, the laneway. I showed you earlier the image of historic children and my own children sitting in the laneway with the little building with the gable sitting there behind. And so this brings me to the nature of the conservation. And this was an unusual conservation project. I mean, this is not a huge ancient monument of the kind that one finds elsewhere in the world. This was a largely foundation-based colonial period archaeological site in an urban context. And so the way in which we went about the conservation was that the conservation needs drove the building design, not the other way around. And we mapped the entirety of the site, every stone, every deposit, every feature. We ranked each and every element, and we designed the building foundations and the building engineering structure to avoid all of the significant archaeological features. And we placed each and every support column individually. The support columns are shown in blue. They are these little tiny rectangular dots. The areas in which the site, the new development sits down towards the original archaeological remains, are shown in red, and then the areas in which remains are incorporated within the building and conserved are shown in orange, with the other remains shown unhatched. Now, that might all be a little hard to follow. What I'm simply saying is that the manner in which the building was designed was dictated by the conservation needs rather than by the desires of the developer. And the outcome of that is that the building actually disturbs less than 5% of the remnant archaeological features on the site. And during construction, the building structure was changed when additional archaeological features were encountered as work proceeded. So each and every feature was carefully sandbagged and protected with geotechnical fabric and sterile sand backfill. There were spaces placed to ensure that structure did not interfere with significant fabric. In the top left-hand side of this image, you can see that there was a platform built which ensured that no disturbance of the archaeological features beneath occurred. Each of the foundations was hand dug, and as I mentioned a moment ago, in one case, when additional archaeological features were, which were unexpected, were discovered, the foundation was moved and the building structure was redesigned. And each of the columns that support the building was individually and manually put in place so as to ensure no disturbance of associated archaeological features. So here you can see the site during works. The archaeological features exist beneath this sterile sand in a secure environment. The platform has been erected to ensure that there is no ancillary damage to the site. And the structure of the building, as you can see from the column on the left, is somewhat unusual and off the orthogonal in order to allow the disturbance to be confined to areas where there were no known archaeological features. Which brings me to the telling of the story. And so this is the site as you enter today. So this is coming off the street from ground level. This is arriving at the Hostel. This is a low budget hotel designed for young people to come and stay. And the first thing that they see when they enter the foyer is that they encounter the archaeological remains. They can understand a whole lot of information by reading a detailed sign, or they can understand just a little information by reading about fragments of a lost neighbourhood or the dates between 1788 and 1901. If they want to, there is quite detailed interpretive signage that relates the extant archaeological remains to the archaeological evidence and the historic record, but it's a matter for individuals about how much they do or don't want to absorb as they interact with the site. The site has been configured in a way which allows people to engage with the real fabric. So this is the historic lane. It's known as Cribb's Lane, named after the convict George Cribb. And to the fullest extent possible, the original stonework is still there. So people can still walk down Cribb's Lane. They can look at historic images. You can see one in one of the signs in the image on screen and understand where they are physically, but also understand where they are historically. They can peer in through the doors of individual houses and see tenements. They can learn about the story of the people who live there. They can see the artifacts which relate to this house. So this is again an image of the foyer, and the storytelling here is very interesting and multi-layered in that you have the original rocks which gave the rock its name. Carved into that rock is some benching and some very early structures. So the structure that I'm highlighting with the cursor here, a rubble stone wall, is the house of an Irish patriot who was sentenced to transportation and lived in Sydney in the early 19th century. And that is cut through and overlain by a later house and shop which fronted the street outside. And all of this evidence is laid bare and interpreted to visitors at multiple levels so they can react with the site and experience it in the manner that they see fit. It's intelligible if you just come and visit the site. You can just deal with the signage, or there are a number of community programs and opportunities which enable people to learn about this place and its history. So, for example, this is an image of the other side of the site, the other street frontage, another hotel called the Whalers Arms, and this is the historic painting of this precinct. This is the site as it looks today, and the screens interpret the historic building. The laneway has been reinstalled, and we're not pretending in any way that this is any kind of reconstruction. It's an interpretation to tell the story. And you can see on the left of this screen where it says the Big Dig. This is the Big Dig Archaeology Education Centre, as shown in an earlier image, where school groups come and they have lessons on site using the resources from the education kits. So they're able to participate in the classroom, they're able to handle the real artifacts from the site, and they're able to step out onto the site to have their lessons in the place where the history about which they're learning really occurred. So here's one of these lessons. So this is actually inside the site. Again, you can see one of these strange off-orthogonal building supports. So this is one of the central spaces. In the top of this image, you can see galleries which have the hostel rooms. The stairway is a fire escape, and on the left, you can see one of the education officers here is conducting a lesson for school students and actually standing in one of the houses, telling the convicts about the place which they are encountering. And you can probably just see this is in fact the facade that I showed you earlier in the shot which had the children in it. And the screen facade here modulates the windows and doors of the house. So the students will have entered off the laneway through the door of the house and are having a real lesson in a real place about real people and real history. And here we have another example. This is up. It's the remains of the house of the convict Patriot Burns. And again, we have another education officer here with a different school group who are able to experience the place firsthand on site. It's not only school groups. I haven't got images to show you of the hotel rooms, but this is the hotel lounge area. And in the lounge area, instead of a regulation coffee table, what is provided is a very clever interactive display of some of the unstratified archaeological remains, which are there as much as artwork, as to provide some context for this special place, which has been developed as a hotel and education centre integrated with an urban archaeological site. And if you kind of sit here enjoying your coffee, talking to your fellow guests, looking down into this artifact display, and you look very carefully, you might just see that we don't take absolutely everything completely seriously. And the artifacts here are used as a tongue-in-cheek message as well as a serious message about the history of the site. So in summary, this is a very interesting and unusual site in that while it's of state significance, it enjoys one of the highest levels of statutory protection. There is a high degree of physical conservation and management carried out. It's a site that has also endured a rather unusual development that is respectful of its urban context, but nevertheless very focused on the ability of the site to tell the story and the opportunities that might be available for people to participate in activities at the site in a way that makes it real for them and connects them with the place, effectively turning archaeology into an event. So at that point, I say thank you, and I would be more than happy to hear any comments or respond to any queries. And it's probably time to stop sharing the screen.
Thank you so much, sir. That was very interesting and very fascinating, that what you were able to do with the archaeological site, and especially like designing the structure in a very non-pretentious manner. That was very interesting. And we have one or two questions, I think, questions from our students. So I would like to take these. So Bhanumati Vishwanathan is asking, sir, a very good way to engage the public with the past. And she has this question that if the fabric is continuously in contact with the people, wouldn't it be lost in future, though it makes people engage with the past and feel it?
Thank you. That's a very good question, and it is one of the challenges at the site. So the site has been characterised in some detail, and a large proportion of the site is stone masonry, and so the stone elements, as you will have seen in the section of the laneway that I showed, are reasonably robust and are managed in the same way that one would manage a stone path at home. So yes, there is some wear and tear, and that is constantly monitored and managed, but it's accepted that this is a real place with a continuing history and that the wear and tear is part of that. That said, there are some other parts of the site, such as the masonry walls that relate to 18th century convict constructions, and nobody steps on them, and they are much more carefully monitored. There's not climate control because the site is open at the sides, but there is a high degree of regular monitoring, regular maintenance. And something that I should have mentioned is that the youth hostel has approximately 80 beds, and for everybody who stays at the youth hostel, every night there is a financial contribution put into a fund which can only be used for the conservation and interpretation of the site. So the economic model for this development also provides for continual upgrade of the interpretation and for effective conservation of the site. How long it will last, that's an interesting consideration, and it may be that over time it becomes necessary to take a more interventionist approach with the physical conservation.
Thank you for elaboration, sir. Professor Shanti Papu, she is thanking you for such a fascinating talk. Yes, I think all of us, we really enjoyed this presentation. I was wondering if I can ask one question. Can you tell us a little bit more about the material selection? I mean, selecting materials and technologies for the new design. I mean, how was the process followed, and how did you arrive at the final decisions?
To begin with, the idea of using this site for hostel accommodation, in other words, it's, you know, the people who stay there are predominantly school students and backpacker travelers and families. And so one of the things about the competition was that the government was very impressed by the idea of providing low-cost accommodation for these groups at this end of the site. And another element of the competition was the design concept. And the design concept recognised that this was a historic precinct on the edge of a modern city. And so the decision was made to have a well-mannered modern building rather than to seek to have some kind of faux colonial facade. And so right from the outset, it was to be a modern building. And then in terms of the materials that are used are predominantly, it's a steel frame building on concrete foundations, and it has a number of ceramic infill panels. You will have seen the brown-orange infill panels. Now, the materials are inert in terms of their reaction with the fabric of the site, and the way in which they were configured on site means that the touchdown has been minimalised and the building has been designed so that it could actually be taken apart and taken away. So in 100 years' time, if there is a different conservation approach taken to this site, it would be possible to demolish the building, and only 5% of the archaeological remains have been affected by the construction of the building, which is really quite remarkable. So both during the design phase and during the construction phase, minimal intervention, inert materials, and a identifiable modern structure in conjunction with a historic site was the approach.
Thank you for giving like the final 3 key points.
Yeah, look, I can see there's one other question about the why the story of a convict became so interesting to dig. And look, I would like to answer that, please. There is a group of Australian convict sites as a serial listing on the World Heritage List. And the convict story in Australia is actually, it's important obviously to Australians, but it is also globally significant because the current geopolitical world, particularly in the Americas, in the Asia Pacific and in Africa, was very much determined by a process during the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries where European nations established settlements through forced migration, through slavery and through prisoners. Now, in the case of Australia, that was through prisoners. So it was a very major thing. There was an Indigenous population here. There was an invasion by the British to establish a colonial seat. And they did that and were able to do it because of the convict labour. So the convict enterprise and that very early phase of convictism is absolutely critical to the reason why Australia is Australia, but it's also part of a global geopolitical process which led to the establishment of what we have today in the modern world. You know, and look, I'm very conscious that the Indian story with the British was quite a different story. You know, in Australia, it was an almost complete takeover of society by the British. I mean, we're doing some things, thankfully, now to remediate that, but it was the convictism that made that happen. And so this site, being the predominant convict site in Sydney, is extraordinarily important, and that's why the archaeological excavation and this whole process has happened.
Thank you. There is one more question regarding public engagement. Would you like to address that as well? Like what Soundarya is asking, that what other programmatical options could be employed in such context for experimental aspect and for engaging people?
Well, look, I should say that one of the things that made this unusual project possible was that the site was already in public ownership with government. And so it was possible for the government to make a decision that we will not have a commercial development. We will proceed with a development that has a social component, the hostel and the education centre and the site conservation. So the government made a decision not to have as much financial income as might otherwise have been possible. So the site is unusual in that respect. But what it has done is it has led to recognition by the corporate community that having such facilities actually does enhance development. So there are a number of other developments in Sydney now that incorporate historical presentation and even archaeological remains as part of a commercial development. And it may be that it's just part of an experience and a display in the foyer, but we have, for example, once a year in Sydney, a weekend called Sydney Open, where properties like this are actually made open to the public, and you can spend your weekend going around and experiencing different aspects of their architecture and their history. We also have, as many nations, including India do, cultural institutions. And so there is an interplay. For example, this site does run programs collaboratively with Sydney Living Museums, which is an institution that operates historic properties. And so there are, you know, in addition to the general programs I've described, there are specific events and programs. And so, I mean, it's possible, for example, to hire this site and to use the education centre for a function, and to have a cocktail party on the roof where you're looking out at Sydney Harbour and the Opera House and the Harbour Bridge as the sun sets, so it's very engaged with normal activity as well as being a special historic place.
Yes, there are a few more questions as well. Yes, sorry, Soundarya, I pronounced experimental instead of experiential. Sorry for that. Yes, there is question from Anandit. Were there instances where the significance of the site had to be re-emphasized for the government? Usually in such instances, capital gains are preferred. What role does the archaeologist play in navigating such decisions?
Look, this is a very difficult circumstance. In this case, what was fortunate was that the government was both the site owner and the regulator, the decision maker. And what was absolutely critical to the government's decision was the media coverage. And so as we commenced the archaeological excavation and it became apparent that there was far more remains present than anybody had expected, one of the things that the archaeological team did was we invited the relevant government minister down to the site to have a press conference to announce the discovery of the remains. And from that moment on, the government was kind of a partner. Now, it doesn't always turn out that fortuitously. There are plenty of other examples where archaeology is characterized as the problem that is preventing a development and needs to be overcome. So I'm not suggesting that the case study I have presented tonight is always going to be applicable. I'm presenting it to show that there are other ways in which archaeological sites can be conserved, managed, adapted, and presented. It's not always a choice between a historic site and a development. This one is in the middle between those two things. And the questioner is absolutely right that especially for sites that are privately owned by companies, quite often it is the commercial economic reality rather than the culture and the heritage which will prevail.
True, very true. I mean, it's most of the time it is similar situation here as well. So I was wondering, are there any similar projects coming up in Australia, like in future also? Do you have any other similar projects now?
There is one in Melbourne. I mean, for those once we recommence travel, international travel, for any who come to Australia, there is a more commercial development in Melbourne. It's known as Little Lonsdale or Castleton Place. It's in the centre of Melbourne. It's half a city block, and it has high-rise commercial development, but it also effectively its ground floor is at the same time, it's almost like a mini museum. So its foyer is almost a museum where the physical remains and archaeological evidence and artifacts are displayed. Not as much of the building remains as this site, but nevertheless an interesting interplay between commercial development and heritage conservation for an archaeological site.
And now in these circumstances, does the regular maintenance of archaeological sites along with the commercial development and especially with this new construction techniques, is it challenging or how that is planned?
It's very challenging. Another reason that this site has been successful is the levy. So every time someone stays at the hostel, there is more money available for the site maintenance, and that has proven financially to be absolutely critical. However, we also have in this state quite good protective mechanisms for sites that are on the state register. So this site is on the state register, and sites that are on the state register are subject to a proactive statutory requirement for minimum standards of maintenance and repair. In other words, even if they're privately owned, if they're included on the state register, the owner must maintain them, and it is an offence not to maintain them.
And then are there any incentives for them to be able to undertake that maintenance successfully?
Yeah, not automatic. So if you have a house, there are private houses that are on our state register. They're significant historic houses, and the government takes the view generally that if you are privileged to own a historic house, then you have the obligation to maintain it. There are grant programs available, and in some areas there is a relief from certain charges, but not always. They're separate but related things. It's not automatic that if you have a listed heritage asset that you automatically get a grant or you automatically get rate relief, but you may.
Right. Yes. Thank you for that. So there is a comment from Tejaswini. I also believe that she is your student from University of Pennsylvania.
That's a long time ago.
Yes. Yeah, she's saying that it is amazing to see how the thought of minimal and reversible intervention was put into the project at this very point, considering the possibilities in the future. So yes, totally agree with you, Tejaswini, that very inspiring blend of archaeology and heritage management.
Yes, and look, it's very easy to sort of talk about it now, but it was quite difficult at the time. So, for example, when we showed the engineers our plan of the site and said, these are the areas where you can put down your footings, they first said, well, we can't do this. And we said, well, you can't, you have to do it. And so the building, if you stay in this hostel, sometimes the rooms that look out at the harbour have a beam through the window because the structure is dictated by the conservation, not by the view for the resident. And the example that I keep mentioning, when we discovered during construction that there was additional archaeological remains, it was the engineer, almost threw a tantrum, threw a fit when we said, no, you can't put the column here, you'll have to move it, because they had to redesign the structure and transfer loads, and it was a major event. It's an unusual approach, but I think what it does demonstrate is that sometimes the significance of the site warrants an approach that's completely different because of the cultural significance.
Yes, true. So our fourth semester student Neha she's thanking you for the presentation, and she's also asking what is the public empathy around this site. I think it might reflect in their site engagement as well.
The public empathy is huge. It's known as the dig site. It is a popular place. People go there. Sydney people go there with their families to stay just because it's such a fun place to be. It's got fantastic views. It's right at the centre of the city. But there are two phases where the public empathy was particularly helpful. In the early phase, when we had people visiting the site and we had to put up a platform so that they could view it and conduct tours, and we were on the television news regularly, the public support and interest is ultimately what facilitated the political decision not to proceed with development. So that was very important. That early public engagement during the dig created a perception from the politicians that the site was valuable. And then these days the site has had something like between 50 and 100,000 school students, have been through conducting educational programs. The site is booked out by school groups months in advance. So it's actually very popular with the community.
Okay. So I was also wondering, we have Janvish sir and Dr. Gargay and Dr. Sabnis, as well as Professor Shanti Papu here, and even Jigna. I'm sure that all of them, they have experienced similar situations in their practice as well. So based on the presentation that we saw just now. Would you like to share your thoughts, or any questions from your side?
No, I don't think I don't have any questions here, but I just want to thank Richard for making this brilliant presentation. We've just started our initiative here from our center to kind of introduce conservation practice in a similar interactive way, where our practices, while we identify a building, we are calling it a conservation site school, where we've identified a building and we are going to do all the processes of documentation, studies, and conservation in a way that it involves people. And as you're saying, yes, we are experiencing a situation where the resources needed, in order to make it open and volunteer based, it requires more resources than just doing it as a project. But I think the approach there is to kind of ensure that there is, as I think Neha mentioned, to engage in a way that there is public empathy around conservation and around a particular site. And I think your example brilliantly kind of demonstrates that. So thank you very much for doing that.
Janvish sir, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, can I? Well, first of all, thank you, Jigna, and thank you, Ms. Mane, for inviting me over. And hello, Richard. I think I'm seeing you after a long time, and I think last time we met in Cambodia. Dr. Papu, hello to you as well. So greetings everyone who is present over there. Richard, thank you. It's a fascinating presentation, and the storyline that you created around it. Even though I had certain questions, if I can ask, and then I could share some of our experiences, which are not quite similar, but maybe along the lines. I just thought, for my own curiosity, that I think it was a fantastic, as I said, the way you handled the site, the way you interpreted the site, and even the design, sort of how you try to relate using archival sort of images and other evidences that you had in place. And sort of nuanced interpretation that you did was quite interesting and exciting. I just thought, I'll ask you a couple of questions. In terms of the architectural vocabulary that you created. Now, in one of the slides where you showed an image of the streetscape, where I think the buildings adjoining are, if I'm not mistaken, maybe late 19th, early 20th century, while you went in for a departure and you did something absolutely modern or late modern or postmodern, however you may want to, sort of whatever ism you may want to use that. So I just wanted to understand that when you had evidences, either through archival images or whatever the street evidences that you have, what was the thought behind for you to sort of have a complete departure and use a very modern architectural language, if I may say so? That was point one I had. Second, I thought I would ask you that because you showed columns and all, even though quite minimalist, but they were all being sort of the foundations and all were coming on the site itself. So do you think was there a compromise, or you found a via media in which you would place the structural elements in a way that the site was tempered to the minimum? Third. Of course, you showed about interpretation. You showed about how the local communities, the school children, and all are being led to the site. I just wanted to understand the site at the location that it is must have had a huge pressure on it, developmental pressure, because the land is the premium over there. How did you manage to strike a balance wherein you kind of ensured or convinced the district authorities or whosoever was at the helm of affairs to sort of leave the site apart and then you sort of work things around it. I thought I would sort of, ask you these questions, and then perhaps during the course of the panel discussion, I would share some of our concerns as well for the excavated remains that we have. I mean, so our antiquity obviously goes back to millennia. So how are we handling these things? I would also sort of try to give an overview of that. But first, I thought I'll ask you these 2-3 questions.
Right. Well, thank you, John Wedge. And yes, it is great to see you. It's been a number of years since Angkor, but good to see you. The architectural vocabulary is an interesting question. There is more than adequate documentation, which would have, for example, allowed a complete reconstruction of the missing historic facade. But the view was taken that this site had not had the historic buildings present since the 1890s when they were demolished, and that in the intervening period, there had been a long stage where there were these erecting workshops for the Harbour Bridge, a very, very utilitarian, simple metal-clad buildings. And then there had been this phase of being a bus park. And so right at the competition stage, and look, I was not the architect. I was in the design team, but there were architects and engineers who were doing the design. Right at the competition stage, it was decided to put this proposal forward on the basis that it would be modern architecture, but it would sit within the streetscape. So, for example, when you take a view of the rocks from higher up on the Harbour Bridge, while you do see this building, it doesn't stand out. It's got a colour palette and a form that is quite benign within the overall urban form. Now, of course, when you're up close, you instantly see this is a very modern building next to a historic building. But the advantage of the modern building is also that we of course got the serviceability. So we were able to do things in terms of floor to ceiling heights, its hotel use, and all that means in terms of services and egress and public areas and circulation. That was much easier in terms of a modern building. In relation to the damage to the site, we graded all of the elements right down to the individual stones, and none of the significant fabric on the site is actually disturbed by the structural support, and all of the other elements were protected during works and then re-uncovered. So they were sandbagged and had geotextile fabric, sterile sand, or there were cofferdams built around them to protect them during works. The actual footprint which touches the ground is less than 5%, and that is areas that were already disturbed for other reasons. So that was areas, for example, where there were foundations associated with the workshops, or where there was just an open area that had never had a building on it. So there is some disturbance to the site, but if it were decided to take the building away, the disturbance would be less than 5% and the rest of the archaeology would be intact. And then what was your third question was related to what? I've lost my thread.
The pressure that you might have had because the land is premium.
Yeah.
So,
look, if this site was owned by a corporation, this project would never have been possible, because the way in which the jurisdiction and the legislation works here, as well as in many other parts of the world, is people make an application to build a building and they have to do some salvage archaeology as part of their permit. And that was the case here. So this was a salvage archaeology project to dig up and remove and record. But when so much was found and there was so much community interest and media interest and political interest, because it was a government project, they said, "Oh, we will change our minds because of the archaeology." That would not have happened in a commercial context. So the critical thing was that the relevant government ministers became enthused about the archaeology.
Sorry, I think he's just on another
Yes,
call.
yeah.
Yeah. Meanwhile, yeah, we are just quickly, if Professor Shanti and Dr. Gargay and Bharat sir, if you would like to share your thoughts before we start with the panel discussion.
Dr. Mackay, it was a wonderful talk and thank you very much for it. I really enjoyed it and so carefully thought out, and public outreach was really fascinating. I just had a very small question. What about future excavations at this site? Would they be incorporated into the general design so that people can get a perspective of the actual excavations being undertaken, or is it over?
No, thanks, Professor Shanti. There is a modest continuing program of excavations. I mentioned a number of times that there are 45 houses. About 15 of them have been completely excavated to the bedrock levels that I showed. A number of them are completely unexcavated and are intact, very substantial deposits, we would assume, which have still hundreds of thousands of artifacts and a century of European occupation. And they probably have other convict remains sitting in their basal layers. That's why, you know, with the column I keep mentioning where we found an unexpected feature, we had identified this area as never having been developed. And as we manually dug the column hole, we found there was a very stratigraphically very early feature, probably another convict house sitting in the base, which is why we moved the column. So from time to time, either for management reasons or occasionally as part of a public program, more excavation is done. And the kind of thing that might be done for management reasons is because parts of the site are open, there is still the need to manage stormwater. So changing the site to provide better stormwater arrangements might involve an intervention. If that's going to have archaeology, then it's done as a public program.
Thank you.
Yes, that was a very important point regarding the stormwater arrangement. Yeah, Dr. Gargay, would you like to, or Bharat sir, either of you would like to share your thoughts?
Good
Dr.
afternoon,
Bharat,
Richard.
yeah.
Yeah, am I audible? Let work continue.
Yeah. Yeah, now you're audible. Yes.
Yeah, it was a wonderful presentation, and especially the public archaeology part of it. In a country like India, it is going to be a very, very instrumental towards conservation of archaeological heritage. And as we all know that India encompasses an archaeological heritage over several millenniums, and to involve people in such activities towards conservation strategies, planning, management will be a great step towards it. And especially I congratulate for taking such initiative, especially taking archaeology beyond archaeologists. So there is no question as such, but I just wanted to appreciate your efforts. Thank you.
Yes, Tejas sir.
Good afternoon, Richard. Very interesting presentation in terms of location of the site and the way it is preserved now. I think this is a good example to be followed by the government agencies all across the globe. And I hope our policymakers will also take a note of this. So thank you so much for presenting this case in front of us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone. I think now we can start with the panel discussion. And I hope all of our students and all the participants are still there. We can't really, if everyone wants to switch on their screens for a minute, at least, so that we know that all of you are there behind the screens. That's great. Thank you. Yes. So we have students from our first year batch as well as from our second year batch, and all of them, they are situated in different parts of the country. So that's very actually interesting thing. I hope that all of them, they find today's discussion helpful, especially for the sites or the areas where they are also working. Yeah. So yeah, all of them are here. So I'll just start with the introduction of our panelists. And once again, I would like to welcome them. And I would like to start with the introduction of Mr. Janvish Sharma. And I'm going to need some time to actually complete the introduction part, because all of them have a lot of achievements, and I would really like to share all of that with our students so that they know that who are the people they are listening from. Yes. So Mr. Janvish Sharma is one of those very few people who is trained as a conservation architect and is presently working amongst all the archaeologists. And currently he holds the position of Joint Director General for Conservation and World Heritage Section in Archaeological Survey of India. So he's working in ASI since 2008, and his primary responsibility is to finalize conservation programs for all the circles in India and monitoring conservation of ASI monuments within and outside the country. He has successfully implemented conservation plan for Red Fort and Purana Killa, also the site management plan for Taj Mahal. And he has spearheaded the conservation works outside India too, noticeably the conservation of Ta Prohm Temple in Cambodia. It also received acclaim from UNESCO-led International Conservation Committee. He has also worked in at Bagan in Myanmar, and in ASI he has undertaken numerous initiatives, and most important being the formulation of national policy for conservation of protected monuments, archaeological sites and remains, which is now adopted by Government of India since 2014. And he has been in charge of World Heritage Matters on behalf of ASI for past 7 years. And during his tenure so far, 10 monuments and sites, including Rani Ki Vav, hill forts of Rajasthan, and Nalanda Mahavihara, have become World Heritage properties. And now he is also working towards nomination of Dholavira, which is one of the famous and the largest Harappan sites in India. He has number of publications to his credits, and that includes book called Architectural Heritage Ladakh, which was published by Intact. And he has done extensive architectural documentation of monasteries in Ladakh and Zanskar region. And of course, he's a very keen traveler and an excellent architectural photographer. So I once again welcome you, sir, and we are really glad that we have a creative person like yourself for today's discussion. So next, I'm really thrilled to introduce our next panelist, Professor Shanti Papu. It is actually challenging to give her very brief introduction, but I'll try. So she is a former professor of prehistory from Deccan College, Pune, from where she has also completed her PhD. And she is also a former Homi Bhabha Fellow and Charles Wallace Fellow, and she has obtained several awards, including Professor H.D. Sankalia Gold Medal from Deccan College and Young Scientist Award, Earthwatch Institute, USA. She holds a law degree with a dissertation on cultural heritage laws in India. She is a founder and secretary of Sharma Center for Heritage Education, which was established in 1999, and it is based in Chennai, in southern parts of India. It is a non-profit public educational trust and aimed at promoting research into India's natural and cultural heritage and creating awareness about this subject amongst public. So, and through this center, Dr. Shanti and her colleague, Dr. Akhilesh, are directing long-term interdisciplinary projects investigating prehistory, paleo environments along the southeast coast of India. They have been conducting research, excavations, training programs at sites known as Athirama Pakkam and Sendra Palayam. Sorry for my pronunciation, in Tamil Nadu. And their work includes combination of field-based investigation, use of satellite, remote sensing, and GIS, public outreach, and advocacy for heritage management. They have published 2 books and over 30 research papers in peer-reviewed journals. And since 1999, the Sharma Center for Heritage Education, through its children's museums, runs workshops for children, teachers, and students on campus as well as in other urban and rural parts of India, plus in Sri Lanka and South Korea. So, and they are also consultants to State Department of Archaeology, to Planning Commission. So that's the work they have been doing. And then recently they have, like since March 2020, they have also shifted to the online platform, and they have this program called Down Asian Trails. So yes, we are delighted to have you, Professor Shanti. Thank you. And our next distinguished scholar and archaeologist is Dr. Pages Gargay, and he is presently the Directorate of Archaeology and Museums in Maharashtra. And he has extensive experience of working in field of archaeology and heritage management for past 2 decades. Specializing in Harappan civilization and firearms, his area of interest are museum, exhibitions, Indian art and architecture, history of Indian art and architecture, forts, fortifications, marine archaeology, heritage management, and legislation. And he has completed his PhD from Deccan College on settlement patterns of Harappan culture in Chotang Basin in 2011. And he started his career as a research associate for Indian Archaeological Society in New Delhi. And from 2003 to 2017, he was working in ASR. And during this period, he was involved in multiple excavations at sites in Balathal, Rakigari, Shavasti, Kamlesh, Dholavira, Daulatabad. So sites ranging from all the various periods. And he was also deputed in China as a curatorial associate for International Exhibition on Indian Art in 2006. And he was also part of Paul Getty Museum. He was also part of International Workshop on Buddhism Art at Paul Getty Museum in 2015. So Dr. Gargay has authored 2 books and 7 joint monographs on study of canons, monuments, sculpture, inventories, and 35 research papers. So, and he has also written in not just in English and Hindi, but also in the regional language Marathi. So presently he is the government of Mumbai Metropolitan Region Heritage Conservation Society and trustee of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya in Mumbai. So yes, thank you, sir. And I also want to thank you for helping us to plan this session. Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
And our 4th panelist is Dr. Varat Sabnis, and he is the Assistant Superintending Archaeologist at the Directorate of Archives and Archaeology in Goa. He's working with the Directorate since 2015. He's also the licensing officer to the Deputy Chief Minister's Office in Goa. And he has completed his PhD from Deccan College on the topic of craft specialization and urbanization in Deccan from the period of 1000 BCE to 300 CE. And he has extensive experience of field archaeology through his participation in various excavation projects on sites such as Shishupalgarh, Lathi, Golbai Sashan, Talpada, Kankaikuda, Ashurdip in Orissa, Junnar and Nagardan as well. He has also done extensive study on hero stones and sati stones in Goa. He is a visiting faculty at Asiatic Society of Mumbai for the Indology course. Plus, he is an active member of International Association of Asian Heritage based in Sri Lanka. So yeah, and then now in addition to all of this, he is also a tutor for our course at CEPT. The course is titled Archaeological Studies, and it is part of Masters in Conservation and Regeneration program under Faculty of Architecture. So thank you, Dr. Sabnis, for developing this theory course for us, and now also being part for the today's discussion. Yes. And then on that note, I once again welcome you on behalf of CEPT University and Center for Heritage Conservation at CRDF. So aim of today's discussion is to know more about the archaeological sites in India from the people who are involved in excavation, in research, excavation, interpretation, preservation, and protection of this wealth. So we will try to look at some of the select sites in chronological order, like from prehistoric sites to protohistoric sites to historic, and then if time permits, even the medieval sites. So yes, so with that, my first question would be to Dr. Subnis. Uh, so, sir, can you tell us about the prehistoric sites in Goa and how these sites were found and what is its present status?
Okay, thank you very much for a wonderful introduction of all the panelist members, and also thank you for having me with you all. Basically, when we talk about Goa, Goa is well known for its natural beauty, and it is also a touristic destination for people from different parts of the globe. Uh, Hope I am audible, right?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
So the question is specifically about the prehistoric rock engravings which are found in Goa and the surrounding areas of Maharashtra and Karnataka. So when these rock engravings were found in Goa, it was somewhere in 1990s, and most of these rock engravings or the finding of these rock engravings were accidental, and these rock engravings are peculiar to these geographical geological conditions of this area, wherein these are engraved, bruised out on lateritic bedrock. And this lateritic rock, which is found in this area of Konkan, Goa, and coastal Karnataka, are typical. These and wherever accidental discoveries were noticed, these were in connection with laterite quarries. And especially in 1993, one big site was noticed when a laterite quarry work was going on, and the workers came across some unusual designs and some artistic features on the surface where the actual work was going on. And then the site inspection was carried out by then director of archives archaeology of Goa, and it was in 1993. And this particular site is very well known now by the name of Pansai Mall. It consists of more than 100 rock engravings. And if you see stylistically, these all are not of one particular time period. Over a period of time. And this is evident from the style, this is evident from the way of bruising or engraving, and also the theme which is there. So there are animals like zebu bull, there are animals like deer, there are human figures, then also an animal which is termed as X-ray animal, where probably an attempt is made to show the internal organs also inside. So the prehistoric heritage of this region consists of various types of rock engravings. Then there is something called as labyrinth, which is concentric circles which are found. Unfortunately, it is very difficult so far with present knowledge, whatever we have in the field of archaeology, to decipher what it means. But similar designs are found in other parts of the world as well. So probably there was some kind of meaning attached to it in the previous prehistoric lifetime. So these were basically found, documented, and similar uh, type of engravings were also noticed at 2 3 more locations in Goa. And we all know that in very recent times, especially in last 3 4 years, a lot of similar engravings were documented, noticed in Konkan area of Maharashtra, especially Ratnagiri district, Sindhudurga district, and also coastal Karnataka. So if we see this entire belt, the rock engravings which are in Goa are very important and significant, not only from the point of view of its archaeological importance, but also overall depiction of culture which prevailed in this area a few thousand years back. So there are many attempts legally, there are many attempts from involving public in creation of awareness and uh, motivating public to be part of the process of protection preservation. wherein people will also feel that they belong or this heritage belongs to them. So such attempts are made. The sites, there are 3 sites which are notified under the State Act, that is the Goa Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Sites and Remains Act 1978. So these sites have got a legal protection, and so there are many attempts to have a proper management of this particular site by considering the landscape. So other panelists will also agree that in most of the prehistoric sites, there are no monuments or structures. The landscape preservation is the most important part. So there are such attempts which are followed and also in pipeline to have a proper management of not only the actual engravings but the landscape which prehistoric times was used by our ancestors. Thank you.
Right. So, like on this note, actually, as you mentioned that there were many recent finds. So, Dr. Garge, if you would like to share about these recent finds in Pokken region, and not just about the discoveries, but also its significance in terms of for that region as well as the global significance about it.
Right. As mentioned by Vard earlier, these all rock engraving sites in Western India, or specifically in Konkan, they were known from 90s to the local people, and some history enthusiast people. They started bringing this to published records. For example, magazines or newspapers. And in 1990s, one such site was brought to the notice of department called Neve Fata, which was about to go under construction of a road. But unfortunately, at that point of time, no action was taken. But a systematic survey was initiated in 2017. And at that point of time, we knew about hardly 10-15 sites. And after exploring for about 2 years, now uh, we know about 52 sites, 52 engraved sites in Konkan, especially in Ratnagiri district. And we are also expanding our activities towards Sindhudurg, and we'll be moving towards Goa. So this is some kind of homogeneous complex of people who actually were practicing engraving of such petroglyphs, and it is more or less seen that it comes from Konkani speaking belt. So that is first presumption about geographical expansion of this particular engraving, rock engraving culture. Second thing is these are mostly depictions of animal, birds, and many aquatic creatures on rock surface on the ground. And second most important category here is a depiction of human figures. Then third is abstracts, and as mentioned by Dr. Vard, it is very hard to interpret these abstract figures, but we found some recent figures from few sites which also appear in Wali paintings. And in Wali paintings, there is some significance of those figures in religious context. They are related to worship of fertility goddess and so on. So it is for sure that they had some religious connotation, and we are also working out to fix some kind of chronology to this. We investigated these sites archaeologically, and we found mycolithic tools from surface of many such sites. And we are more or less presuming that this whole activity began during Mesolithic era, and it has continued till early historic times. So this is the first very preliminary assumption, and we are also looking for some archaeological sites where we get such microliths in habitational deposits. And for past 2 years, a directorate has been excavating a site called Koroshi in Sindhudurga district, which has got a deposit of about 90 centimeters to 1 meter 10 centimeters, and which has yielded Mesolithic tools with some heavy tool technology, which we presume to be of Upper Paleolithic age. And we're anticipating that we'll have Mesolithic layer on the upper side and Upper Paleolithic at the lowermost levels, but they are appearing in simultaneous context. So we are still investigating this phenomenon, and this has practically changed dynamics of